I've never been someone who gets scared easily. I've always enjoyed exploring dark places, getting lost on trails that few dare to tread. The feeling of mystery in the forest was something that attracted me, as if there were ancient secrets waiting to be discovered. But nothing prepared me for what I found that night. It was a moonless night, the cloudy sky barely let a bit of light through. The trees seemed to swallow everything around them, and the wind, which usually brought some tranquility, seemed to murmur something incomprehensible. What was there in the shadows was not normal. As I walked along the narrow trail, the sounds of dry leaves under my feet echoed in the silence. I used to think that the forest had a life of its own, but at that moment, it seemed like everything was still. And that, for some reason, made me restless. It was as if time had stopped along with nature in a silent wait. That's when I heard something. A distant sound like a cracking coming from somewhere beyond the trees. It seemed to be an animal, perhaps an old tree breaking in the wind, but something told me it was nothing like that. Something was different, something was there with me. The air became denser, heavier, and the feeling of being watched began to bother me deeply. I took a deep breath and continued, trying to shake off the premonition. But as I advanced, the forest seemed to envelop me even more. Each step seemed to take me deeper into something I didn't understand. And for some reason that fascinated me. Or maybe it terrified me. But the truth is that at that moment, I still didn't know what was in store for me. I only knew that something was about to happen. That night, as I walked along the dark trail, I began to remember the stories I had always heard when I was younger. Stories told by people who knew the forest much better than I did. Stories about creatures, beings that hid in the shadows, waiting for a chance to show themselves, but always running away from the light. Beings that were more legend than reality, or so it seemed. They are just stories, I used to tell myself. But that night, the whisper of the wind seemed to bring something different. As if the forest was not just a place of trees and animals, but something much older, much more alive. Among the old locals, one legend in particular stood out. They told me about a creature called the Shadow of Loria, an entity that inhabited the deepest forests. They said that the shadow was not made of flesh and bones, but of pure darkness, something that crawled along the ground, camouflaged in the shadows of the trees. No one knew exactly what it looked like because no one had ever lived long enough to describe it. But the story said that its presence was felt long before it was seen, and that the only way to escape it was to never look back. Others spoke of something even more terrifying, the beast of the abyss, a monster that appeared when the darkness of night became impenetrable, something that could never be seen up close but could be heard in distant roars. Legend said that its eyes were as red as fire, and that the moon's rays could not touch it. It always appeared when someone was in forbidden territory, someone who should not be there, someone who was about to cross the line between the real world and the world of shadows. I remembered how I had always laughed at these stories as a child. I thought they were just explanations for the fears that everyone carries within them. But now, as the forest around me seemed to grow denser and darker, a part of me began to question everything I knew about the world. What was hiding there deep in those trees? What did those stories really mean? Suddenly, a snap, something large breaking branches behind me brought me back to reality. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was something or someone. The legend that had once seemed so distant was now starting to become very, very real. The crack behind me was enough to make me stop. My eyes quickly scanned the darkness around me, but I saw nothing. Only the shadows of the trees dancing in the wind. I told myself it was just nature, that it was nothing more than an animal moving around. However, something in my stomach told me otherwise. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. Cautiously, I started walking again, but this time more carefully. Each step felt heavier, the sound of the leaves under my feet echoed loudly, as if the forest was listening to me, waiting to see what I would do next. I wanted to get out of there. The trail seemed endless, and the further I walked, the further I felt I was getting away from the real world. The air was thick, humid, and the mist began to rise, shrouding the trees in a cloak of mystery. Suddenly, the crack again. Louder now. But this time it was closer. Very close. I froze. My breathing became heavy, and the feeling that someone or something was behind me was overwhelming. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing but shadows. My heart was beating too fast, but still I was overcome by a dark curiosity. I needed to know what was happening, what was lurking there. Cautiously, I began to walk back, keeping my eyes fixed on the shadows, waiting for something to appear. The forest was completely silent, except for the sound of my breathing and the distant rustling of leaves. Then something broke the silence. A muffled sound, as if something large had moved among the trees. It was unmistakable. It was something or someone approaching. That was when I saw it. Or rather, when I felt it. A presence. It wasn't a visible movement, but something much larger than that. It was a feeling of being watched, as if the very eyes of the forest were upon me. I could feel the weight of those shadows. I tried to remain calm. Maybe it was just my mind, my nerves, my fear. Maybe it was a trick of the wind. But no. The presence was there and I was no longer alone. I decided to move forward, forcing my feet to move, but as I did so, I was overcome by an even stronger, more palpable sensation. Something was creeping behind me, moving in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. The crack was followed by a low whisper, barely audible, but enough to send a chill down my spine. "Who's there?" I said, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. But the answer was silence. Fear enveloped me completely. I needed to run, but I didn't want to turn my back on what was there. I knew that if I did, it would be too late. I was in unknown territory, in a place where logic didn't apply, where reality was beginning to crumble. Then I saw it. It wasn't something clear, it wasn't a defined shape, but there was something moving among the trees. Something big. Something that didn't belong in this world. I saw his eyes, or what seemed to be a faint but intense light. It glowed in the darkness like flames. But I didn't look for long. Because as soon as those eyes met mine, something inside me screamed to run. And I did. I don't know how long I ran, but it seemed like the forest never ended. The shadows grew thicker and thicker, and the crackling and whispering were everywhere. The ground, which had once seemed familiar, was now treacherous terrain. Every step was a challenge. But the feeling that something was behind me was relentless. I ran until I couldn't run any longer, until the forest finally began to open up, and I, without knowing how, found a wider trail. The fear was still there, but at least I was away from where the shadows were thickest. I looked back, but I saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I knew that something was there, in the shadows, waiting. And I knew deep down that the forest still held secrets that I wasn't ready to discover. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. When I finally reached the end of the trail, relief was immediate. But I couldn't take my eyes off the shadows of the forest. Even now, from a distance, something was nagging at me deeply. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a premonition. Something was watching me. And more than that, something was waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As I walked away from the forest and onto the road, the night seemed quieter, calmer. But as I looked out at the vast field before me, my uneasiness didn't diminish. I wanted to believe that it was all just an illusion, a trick of my tired mind, but the sight of those eyes glowing in the shadows was still clear in my memory. They were like flames in the dark, as if the night itself were alive and breathing. I decided that I couldn't keep this doubt hanging in the air. I couldn't let fear take over me, but on the other hand, I couldn't ignore what had happened either. So I did what anyone who had seen what I had seen would do. I went back. Going back into that forest after what had happened was a difficult decision. Every step felt like a weight. Every crack in the branches seemed louder, more threatening. But curiosity and the need to understand what was happening spoke louder. And when I returned, it was as if I had trespassed on forbidden territory, as if the forest itself knew I shouldn't be there. The darkness seemed thicker now, more threatening. The sounds of the forest had disappeared, and the wind had died down. As if nature itself had stopped to watch me. I kept going, not knowing exactly what I expected to find. But with each step, the feeling of being followed intensified. It was no longer just a sound or a presence. It was something tangible, something I could feel on my skin. It was there all around me. That was when, as I turned a narrow bend in the trail, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. It wasn't a creature, not in the literal sense, but something much more subtle. A shadow. It was as if the darkness of the forest had taken shape, as if it had become something more concrete, something more human. It moved between the trees, gliding in a way that defied logic. It made no sound, but I could see its movement, a dark line against the misty background of the forest. The eyes appeared again. Those bright eyes, with an intensity that seemed to absorb the light around them, as if they were two flames, two bonfires in a sea of shadows. I knew I shouldn't look at them, but my eyes were drawn to them as if an invisible force were pulling me. And when I did, it felt as if time had stopped. The air around me grew heavy, and I felt that, in that moment, I had crossed an invisible line. The shadow came closer, but not in an obvious way. It was more as if it were stretching to reach me, as if the darkness of the forest itself were a fabric expanding toward me. I was overcome by a feeling of helplessness, as if I were facing something that had no explanation, something that should not exist. I tried to move, I tried to run, but my legs were paralyzed. I was stuck there, watching that entity, not knowing if I should be afraid or simply accept the inevitability of it. The shadow didn't speak. It didn't need to. It communicated through its presence, through the feeling that at any moment something could happen. But then, suddenly, the shadow disappeared, as if it had been swallowed by the night itself. The eyes, which had previously shone like fire, went out, and the forest returned to its uneasy silence. There was nothing left. Only the sound of the wind, which was slowly returning, and the crackling of dry leaves beneath my feet. I was alone. Or at least that's what I thought. In that moment, the forest returned to the place I knew. But the feeling that something was still there watching never left me. I knew I wasn't alone. Something deeper, darker had touched me. And now, I was part of that story, part of the legend that I thought was just fiction. The forest had left its mark on me, and I knew I wouldn't leave without taking a part of it with me. Now, what I didn't know was, to what extent was that legend true? What exactly were those creatures? And most importantly, why had I been chosen to find Loria's shadow? I didn't have the answers, but I knew I couldn't run away. Not now. The feeling of being watched never left me from the moment I saw the eyes in the shadows. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. With every step, the weight of those invisible presences seemed to grow. It was no longer a question of superstition or an overactive imagination. I knew with a disturbing certainty that the forest was alive, that there was something out there that wanted me, something that was watching me from afar, waiting for the right moment to act. That night seemed endless. The darkness was no longer just the absence of light, but a threatening presence, as if the forest itself were feeding on my fear. I tried to ignore it, but with every snap of the branch, every whisper in the wind, I couldn't help but look back, as if something or someone was following me. That was when I began to notice patterns. Along the trail, I noticed strange movements among the trees. First it was a distant sound, a low scratching, as if something was dragging itself along the ground. Then a peculiar smell began to fill the air, something sweet and sickening, like rotting flowers mixed with damp earth. It was a smell that made me swallow hard, and my stomach churned as it grew stronger. I knew something was there, but I couldn't see it. It was as if I were being tested, as if the forest were playing a game with me. With every step I took, it challenged me to keep going, to go deeper. As I walked away from the clearing where the shadow had disappeared, the trail became narrower, more winding. I could hear the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the emptiness, as if the forest were trying to amplify the feeling of loneliness. But something was still there, something closer now. The feeling of being hunted grew stronger with every second. Suddenly the air grew colder. A chill ran down my spine, and the sky, which had been clear until then, was covered in dark clouds. The wind began to blow harder, and the trees around me began to creak, as if they were bending towards something much larger than themselves. A shadow stretched between the trees, and I knew instinctively that the shadow was not a tree but something moving. Something large. Something watching me. I stood frozen, trying to identify what was happening. Something was approaching me, but it was not an animal. It was not human. It was something that should not exist. Something that defied all the laws of nature. And I knew that if this were to be my end, there would be no escape. The sound was getting closer, dragging itself along the ground with a rhythmic rhythm, as if it were following me. I could feel the weight of what was approaching, and it was no longer a simple shadow. This thing had a shape, a structure. It was tall, taller than any man, with long, thin limbs. But what chilled me most was the sensation that it was not a physical being, but a presence. Something ethereal, something that fed on fear and despair. I knew I was being hunted, and that feeling of helplessness overcame me. At any other time, I would have tried to run. But I knew deep down that if I turned my back and ran, something much worse would happen. Whatever was behind me would not let me escape. And that was when, in the absolute silence of the forest, I heard a sound that cut through my soul. A low whisper, like a voice coming from deep within the earth, a voice full of promises of pain and destruction. I didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. You cannot escape. I looked around, desperate, trying to find a way out, trying to understand what was happening. And then, something began to materialize in the shadows in front of me. It wasn't like a normal figure, but like a distortion of reality. A black, tangled shape with eyes shining like stars. They were large, almost impossible to describe, and reflected a red light that seemed to shine from the darkness itself. I wanted to scream, to run, but something was paralyzing me. It was no longer ordinary fear, it was a feeling that I was facing something immeasurable. Something that should not be in this world. And then the voice spoke again, but this time in a language I had never heard before, hissing, full of strength and threat. Each word seemed to cut through the air around me, as if the forest itself were reacting to the presence of this creature. What disturbed me most, however, were not the words themselves, but the effect they had on me. I felt a growing weight in my chest, as if the air around me were becoming thicker, harder to breathe. The feeling that the forest itself was alive and closing in on me intensified. I was trapped. There was no escape. The creature, the shadow I had encountered earlier, now revealed itself fully, and I realized that it was no ordinary shadow, but an entity, a being that existed beyond human comprehension, a being that should not inhabit the world of the living. Now, more than ever, I knew that my survival depended on something beyond reason. The forest was not just watching me, it was hunting me. I didn't know how much time had passed since I heard that voice, but something inside me knew that this moment was crucial. Every second that I remained there, in that forest, brought me closer to what I didn't understand. And as I tried to process what was happening, the air around me seemed denser, more charged with a palpable energy. The creature that I had seen in the shadows was no longer just looming at the edges of my field of vision. Now it stood before me in all its terrifying grandeur. The shadow was no longer a skeletal movement among the trees. It was a solid presence, but not physical. I could not find words to describe its form, for it followed no logic of the real world. It was as if it were made of pure darkness, a twisted mass of liquid darkness, its contours seeming to change with every glance. Its eyes, enormous and luminous, shone with an intensity that momentarily blinded me whenever I dared to look directly into them. And I knew that if I stared long enough, I could lose my soul to that hypnotic glow. The eyes were fixed on me, and more than that, it felt like my very essence was being absorbed, consumed by that creature. My entire body was paralyzed, as if I had been caught in an invisible web that wouldn't let me move. I wanted to run, I wanted to escape, but I couldn't move. The strength of that presence annihilated me, crushed me inside. It was then that the creature moved. Not in a hurry, not in anger, but with absolute calm, as if it knew that time was something it controlled. Its movements were fluid, as if it were not formed by matter, but by an older, denser substance, something that existed before everything, before nature itself. You know what this is, don't you? The hissing voice that came from the creature made me shiver. That sound was something that did not come from a human being. It was an ancient language, a forgotten language, and the words carried an unearthly weight that reverberated in the air around me. I don't understand. My voice sounded weak, trembling, as if the very word I tried to pronounce was suffocated by the creature's presence. It moved closer, and as it did, the atmosphere around it became heavier, more suffocating. The entire forest seemed to spin, as if it were bending over backwards to deliver me into the hands of that being. The branches of the trees intertwined, creating an invisible wall around me, as if there was no escape. "There is no escape," the creature said, its words echoing inside my mind. "You came here for a reason. And now you must pay the price." My mind was in turmoil. What did it mean? Why me? I had done nothing to deserve this, to be dragged into this nightmare. "You don't understand the power of the forest, do you?" The voice drawled, its presence seeping into every corner of my being. "It is older than men, older than the gods themselves. And it chooses who enters and who does not leave." I knew those words were not simple threats. They were a warning. The forest, that place I had ventured into out of pure curiosity, was more than just a setting. It had real power. Something that was beyond anything I had ever known. Something that enveloped me completely, like an invisible chain that kept me trapped, with no chance of escape. The creature was now just a few steps away from me. I could feel the cold air around it, the dampness of the shadows it carried with it. The feeling of being consumed by darkness was absolute, as if it were sucking the light from within me, erasing my very existence. I wanted to scream, but my voice faded before it could leave my throat. And then, something strange happened. I felt a change in the environment, something that seemed to defy logic. The creature that had been watching me with glowing eyes now seemed to hesitate. Its presence, once overwhelming, now seemed to waver, as if it were in doubt. The forest seemed to pulse, as if breathing of its own accord, and the creature stepped back for a moment, retreating into the shadows. That was when I heard it. Not a voice, but a melody. Soft, distant, almost ethereal, as if an ancient song were being played deep within the forest. A song I had never known existed, but which, upon hearing it, something inside me recognized. The creature, for a moment, seemed shaken, as if the sound were something that affected it directly. Its eyes flickered, and it began to move backward, as if the sound itself were pushing it away. You cannot stop what is about to happen," the creature said, its voice trembling for the first time. "Nothing can change now. The price will be paid." But at that moment, I could no longer hear the creature's words. The melody intensified, and the forest around me began to vibrate with an indescribable force. I stood there without understanding how or why, but the music was guiding me. And for a brief second, I felt that the forest, that creature, that everything around me, was under the control of something much greater, much older. Before I could reflect on what was happening, the forest seemed to open up in front of me as if giving me a path. I knew that this was my only moment, my only chance to escape this creature, this presence. But the question was, could I really escape? Or was this just another part of the forest game? The music continued. The creature continued to watch me, its eyes now dim, its form trembling in the darkness. And I, with the feeling of being on the edge of something greater than my understanding, prepared to follow the path that opened before me. The last thing I heard from the creature was its hissing voice, "You will never be the same after this." The awakening of darkness. I didn't know exactly what was happening, but a deeply unsettling feeling took hold of me. As the music, as ethereal as the fog, echoed louder in my ears, my mind filled with a whirlwind of disconnected thoughts. I was being carried away by something greater than myself, something beyond what any logic or rational explanation could comprehend. The path that opened before me seemed to stretch on indefinitely, a dark trail surrounded by trees that seemed even taller and more imposing than before. But the forest, despite its size and power, now seemed more inviting, as if it were calling me, as if it were my only refuge from this endless nightmare. I could no longer trust my perception, not even what I saw in front of me. The trees, which had previously been imposing and threatening, now seemed to recede as if they were making way for something greater. The music, which somehow seemed to be the key to what was happening, filled the air, making it heavier and more distant, as if the earth itself were breathing along with me. With each step, the feeling of being watched disappeared, but a new sensation took its place, a sense of belonging, of acceptance by something greater. But I knew that this peace was temporary. Whatever I was experiencing, it was not natural. I was no longer in the forest I knew. I was somewhere else, somewhere between the real and the supernatural. And as I walked, each step seemed to bring me closer to something profound and enigmatic. The forest was becoming part of me, and I was part of it. The creature had not followed me, at least not physically, but something told me that it was still there, watching from afar. I did not know why it had moved away or what the music meant, but one thing was certain. The forest was alive in a way I had never imagined. It was more than just a mass of trees and bushes. It was an entity, a being that existed in its own reality, and I was now part of that reality. At a certain point, the path narrowed and the music began to fade, becoming a mere distant echo until it stopped completely. The forest, which had previously seemed alive, was now silent. The air was heavy, and I felt a growing pressure around me, as if a great storm was about to form. It was then that something strange happened. I stopped without meaning to and looked at the ground. The leaves, which had previously been dry and dark, began to move slowly as if they were alive. They rose, floating in the air, forming incomprehensible patterns, as if they were creating their own language, a message from another world. The wind, which had previously been calm, began to blow strongly, and the trees, which had seemed to have moved away, now bowed towards me as if greeting me or perhaps testing me. I didn't know what to do. What was I supposed to do in the face of such a force of nature? What was real? What was illusion? I could no longer trust my senses. The forest itself seemed to swallow me, and I didn't know if I should fight it or simply accept it. The heaviness in the air was suffocating me, and a growing fear took hold of me. "You still don't understand, do you?" The voice, softer and more distant, seemed to come from the very roots of the earth. "This is your place now. You will never leave here." I tried to look around, searching for some explanation for what was happening, but everything around me seemed to distort. The trees spun, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to crumble, as if I were walking on a liquid surface. A feeling of dizziness took over me, and for an instant I almost fell. But something held me. Something invisible but strong, like a hand of shadow, held me up. "This place belongs to no one. But now you are one of us," the voice said, echoing in my mind. I could no longer distinguish what was real from what was not. It was as if my very perception was being shaped by the forest, as if I were being transformed by the very earth I stood upon. The air around me was vibrating, and a sense of disintegration was taking over my body. I knew this was not normal. I was being absorbed, fused with the forest itself. With each step, the darkness grew more intense, and I felt as if nature itself was consuming me, as if I were a part of it, a missing piece in a puzzle of infinite dimensions. And then the music returned. Not in the same way, not with the same softness. Now it was a dark melody, deeper and more ancient, that seemed to rise from the very heart of the forest. The earth shook beneath my feet, and I knew that this was the awakening of something much older than the forest itself. Something that had been silent for millennia, something that had been waiting for me. The feeling of being consumed and swallowed by the forest grew stronger with each passing second. It was as if it were transforming me, making me part of its eternal cycle. I no longer knew where the physical world ended and the darkness began. But one thing I knew for sure, something far more powerful than I was now in control of. "You will not return," the hissing voice said, and I knew that this was the truth. The forest, the being, the entity, all of it was now part of me. And I was part of it. That was just the first part of this story full of mystery and tension. Want to know how it all ends? Don't miss the continuation in the second part of the video. The ending is unmissable.